Welcome to reform thinking. So I want you to just imagine something for a second. Imagine your entire city, the local government, the economy, and your whole social life. It is all built around a single, massive pagan temple.
Right, and we are talking about one of the wonders of the world here. This is a massive structure.
Yeah, precisely. And if you refuse to bow to the idol inside that temple, you do not do business. You do not eat. Now, I want you to imagine you are tasked with keeping a tiny, fledgling community of believers from compromising with that culture.
That sounds like an impossible situation, honestly.
It really does. But, that was the actual reality for a young pastor named Timothy. And we are jumping straight into a massive deep dive today. We are looking at two intense, academically rigorous expositions focused entirely on a single verse, which is 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7.
And that text reads, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness.
Right. So we are going to unpack the theology, the history, and the Greek syntax behind those two sentences. But to set the stakes, the authors actually cite a recent Barna survey. It shows that over 60% of modern churchgoers elevate their subjective personal experiences above objective biblical doctrine.
Over 60%. That is a staggering number.
Yeah. I mean, over 60%. People are deciding what is true based on what they feel in the moment, rather than resting on the objective truth of Scripture.
Well, the authors of our text look at that specific cultural moment and conclude that the modern church is suffering from what they call a lethal injection of superficiality. So the stakes established in these expositions are incredibly high.
They really are. I mean, this is not a casual self-help discussion, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It is not a lighthearted chat about moral improvement either. The text frames the situation as an absolute life and death battle for the human mind.
Wow. A life and death battle.
Yeah. The authors argue that the religious entertainment industry has ballooned into this massive enterprise precisely because people naturally gravitate toward fables and emotionalism. They choose that over the sovereign truth of God.
So the objective here is essentially to wake up the slumbering listener, right?
Yeah.
To shake them out of the narcotic effects of false teaching.
That is the goal. We are looking at a strict demand to abandon theological frivolity. The text wants you to recognize that true sanctification is a strenuous, deliberate exertion.
Okay, so to grasp why the Apostle Paul was so intense about this, we have to look at the physical and cultural location where this command landed. We are talking about ancient Ephesus in the 1st century.
And Ephesus was not some quiet rural village.
No, not at all. It was a bustling, dark, pagan metropolis. You could basically think of it as the Wall Street and Las Vegas of the ancient world rolled into one.
That's a great way to picture it.
Yeah, and it was completely dominated by the cult of Artemis, also known as Diana. Her temple was just colossal. The city's entire economy, its social structure, and its civic pride were tied to this idolatry.
You had silversmiths making massive wealth off idol shrines, right?
Oh, yeah. Huge amounts of money. And they had these festivals that drew tourists and pilgrims from across the known world. And right in the middle of this openly hostile environment, you have Timothy. He is pastoring a very young church.
But our sources point out something really fascinating here. The external paganism, the giant temple, the Roman guards, that was not actually the most dangerous part.
Wait, really? The giant pagan temple was not the main threat?
No, the real threat was internal. False teachers were bringing a dangerous syncretism into the church. They were blending early Gnosticism with apostate Judaism.
Oh, wow. So they were mixing all these different incompatible ideas together.
Yeah, they were introducing speculative genealogies and a harsh asceticism. Basically, they were forbidding people to marry and commanding them to abstain from certain foods.
So, how did that internal threat actually operate? What was the underlying philosophy there?
Well, it operated on a philosophical system called dualism. For you listening who might not be familiar with that term, dualism in this specific context is the idea that physical matter is inherently evil and only the invisible spirit is good.
Okay, so they thought the physical body was something bad that needed to be punished.
Yeah. The source material notes that these false teachers were promoting this idea to look hyper-spiritual. But that concept is entirely foreign to the biblical worldview. In the Bible, God created the physical world and called it good.
Right, so these teachers were completely missing the mark.
They were. They were blurring dispensational lines and imposing illegal applications of Old Testament law onto the New Testament church. They concocted these elaborate allegorical interpretations of genealogies.
And I assume those interpretations just generated useless controversies, right?
Precisely. They taught that to be truly holy, You had to punish the physical body, reject marriage, and follow strict dietary laws. They were trying to manufacture holiness through human asceticism.
Wow. So the sources make it clear that these internal heresies were remarkably similar to the extra-biblical Greco-Roman mythologies surrounding them. They created this endless labyrinth of speculative theology.
Yeah, that is a perfect summary.
That makes me think of a mechanical analogy. Imagine the Ephesian church as a highly secure clean room in a laboratory, like the kind where scientists wear full hazmat suits and pass through airlocks to keep out even a single microscopic contaminant.
Oh, I like that analogy.
So Timothy is the technician in charge of keeping that room sterile.
Yeah.
Outside, you have the massive pollution of the Artemis cult. But inside, people are actively trying to open the airlocks to let in these microscopic, toxic particles of Gnosticism and legalism.
That paints a very clear picture of the danger.
But I am curious about the sociological pressure here. How did the political weight of the Roman Empire factor into this? Because the sources mention economic disenfranchisement for not participating in pagan festivals.
Right, there were severe financial consequences.
So how did that external pressure make the temptation to compromise so overwhelming for the people inside that clean room?
Well, under extreme social and economic pressure, human nature naturally seeks a middle ground. Think about it. If refusing to participate in the imperial cult or the festivals of Artemis meant you could not buy or sell, or that your neighbors would completely ostracize you, the temptation to soften the edges of the gospel would be immense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you are talking about losing your livelihood.
Yeah, the natural human reaction is to look for a compromise. People probably wanted an inclusive roundtable discussion to find common ground with the surrounding culture, or even with the false teachers inside the church.
Just to relieve some of that unbearable pressure?
Yes, but the sources highlight that the Apostle Paul demanded uncompromising rejection instead of ecumenical dialogue. Paul did not advise Timothy to adapt to the culture at all.
He demanded an absolute militant stance against any doctrine that deviated from the Orthodox faith.
Right. The early Christians could not just blend in to save their businesses. They were commanded to conquer the culture with the unadulterated truth. And that meant facing the economic and social consequences head-on.
So knowing the external pressure of Ephesus really explains why the letter is structured the way it is. First Timothy is a pastoral epistle, and it is heavily focused on church governance and purity.
And the entire book pivots on a central hinge.
It does. That hinge is found in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. It establishes the church as the pillar and buttress of the truth. That is the structural reality informing everything else.
The church is the defender of the truth in a world full of lies.
Yeah. And because of that, when you turn the page to chapter 4, the tone shifts drastically. It opens with this chilling, prophetic warning about the latter times, and a departure from the faith driven by deceitful spirits and teachings of demons.
So the literary structure moves from defining the church as the pillar of truth directly into a warning about demonic attacks on that very truth.
Exactly. Now, the authors of our source material read this text through a specific lens, right?
Yes, they use a dispensationalist, premillennial, and pre-tribulational lens.
Okay, let us break that down a bit for the listener without getting bogged down in too much academic jargon.
Sure. So dispensationalism is a theological framework. It sees God administering different rules for different eras of human history. Premillennialism looks forward to a literal future 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does that perspective shape their reading of this passage?
From that perspective, the authors understand the latter times not just as a remote future event right before the end of the world. They view it as the entire period between Christ's first and second comings.
Oh, so the church age right now is the latter times.
Yes. Therefore, this entire age is characterized by increasing doctrinal deviation and spiritual warfare. The apostasy described in the first few verses of chapter 4 is the immediate, dark backdrop to the command in verse 7.
So Paul actually spends the beginning of the chapter exposing the demonic origin of these false teachings. You cannot grasp the command to reject myths unless you first recognize the demonic nature of the apostasy threatening the church.
That is the core issue.
I really want you, the listener, to notice the sharp contrast the text draws here. If you look at chapter 3, it concludes with what the source calls the mystery of godliness,
which is a beautiful, cohesive confession of faith centered entirely on the person and work of Christ.
Yeah, it is gorgeous. Then immediately in chapter 4, we are hit with the myths of ungodly speculation. So you have the glorious mystery of Christ on one side and the deceptive teachings of demons on the other.
It sets up a complete dichotomy. There is absolutely no neutral ground here.
None at all. You are either resting in the mystery of godliness, or you are being seduced by the myths of the latter times.
And that contrast exposes the absolute absurdity of the false teachers, which the source material highlights brilliantly.
How so?
Well, these teachers presented themselves as elite, enlightened individuals. They used their harsh asceticism like forbidding marriage and foods as proof of their superior spiritual status.
Ah, I see. They thought they were better than everyone else.
Yes, yet the text reduces their intricate elite doctrines to the work of liars whose consciences are seared. Paul strips away their sophisticated veneer completely.
He reveals that their teachings are hypocritical and demonically inspired.
Yes, he completely invalidates their claim to spiritual superiority. He defends the goodness of God's creation against their restrictive man-made rules.
So, because the stakes are literally demonic deception, the text demands an aggressive response. We cannot just politely disagree with demons, obviously.
No, you have to fight back.
So the authors break down the Greek syntax of the negative command in the first half of the verse. The phrases have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths.
The sentence structure there is really interesting.
It is. It is an antithetical parallelism that pivots on the Greek conjunction de, which translates to but, or rather. This creates a mutually exclusive choice.
And the verb used there is paratu, right?
Yeah, paratu. It is a present middle imperative. That means it is a continuous, lifelong habit of refusing or rejecting. You do not just reject the myth once and move on.
You are constantly actively pushing it away.
Right. And the objects you are rejecting are mythos, meaning fabrications or myths. These myths are modified by two very descriptive adjectives. First, babulous, meaning profane or unhallowed.
And the second one is graftes, meaning silly or old womanish.
Dissecting that word graches provides incredible insight here.
It really does. The source notes that it is a hapax legomenon. That means it is a word used only once in the entire New Testament.
Only once. That is fascinating.
Yeah. And when we look at extra-biblical Greco-Roman literature, like the writings of Plato or the geographer Strabo, this specific phrase was a well-known derogatory idiom.
How did they use it?
It was used by philosophers to dismiss philosophically bankrupt superstitions. We are talking about the kind of baseless, illogical tales used to frighten credulous children.
So the syntax here is incredibly deliberate.
Very deliberate. The adjectives define the exact nature of the false teaching. It is not just factually incorrect, it is unholy, and it is intellectually pathetic.
You know, I can hear a potential modern reaction to this right now. Someone might ask, isn't the phrase old wives' tales dismissive or harsh? Does it not sound like a condemnation of older women?
That is a very fair question to bring up.
And our source material anticipates this reaction and clarifies it. The text states that this is absolutely not a condemnation of older women. Paul honors them heavily in other parts of his letters.
So what is he doing here then?
He is deliberately using sanctified sarcasm. Paul is taking a well-known cultural idiom to deliberately humiliate the arrogant false teachers.
Oh, I see. These men thought they were intellectual giants with their endless genealogies and ascetic rules.
Yeah, and Paul compares their complex theological systems to childish fables. He's puncturing their pride with this specific, biting vocabulary. It paints him not just as a pastor, but as a razor-sharp cultural critic.
By identifying the error and labeling it so accurately, Paul establishes a definitive boundary for the believer. The mind is a sanctified vessel, not an open sewer meant to receive the filth of the world.
Right. The command to have nothing to do with these myths is an ongoing act of intellectual and spiritual repudiation. We have to recognize that not all ideas are equal.
Some are inherently profane and devoid of the sacred. But this creates a fascinating psychological problem, does it not?
What do you mean?
Well, if you completely empty someone's mind of these cultural fables, you leave a vacuum. And as we know, human nature abhors a vacuum. They're going to fill it with something else.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. You cannot just empty a vessel and leave it bare.
No, you cannot. And this physiological and spiritual reality leads directly to the next mandate in the text.
So what does Paul tell Timothy to fill it with? This brings us to the second half of the verse, which is the positive command. Rather, train yourself for godliness.
The Greek verb used here is gymnase, which is where we get the English word gymnasium.
And it is a present active imperative. Right?
Yes. The text also uses the reflexive pronoun ceton, which places the burden of action directly on the individual believer. You cannot hire someone to do this for you.
You have to do the work yourself. And the destination of this intense exertion is pros eusebion, meaning toward godliness or piety.
Right.
Now, I am stuck on this word gymnast. I go to a modern gym, and it is full of televisions, smoothies, and air conditioning. But when a first century Ephesian heard that word, what were they picturing? Because I'm guessing it was not a comfortable Pilates class.
No, definitely not.
Mhm.
The choice of the word gymnase is incredibly deliberate. The Holy Spirit bypassed softer educational words here.
Like, what kind of word?
Words like didasko, which means to teach, or paidu, which means to instruct. In the first century Greco-Roman world, the gymnasium was not a place of light recreation.
What was it like?
It was a center of agonizing, sweat-inducing exertion. Athletes stripped away all their clothing to remove every single hindrance. It signified rigorous, painful physical exertion aimed at achieving supremacy.
Wow. By using this specific word, the text asserts that practical sanctification requires similar grueling effort.
Yes, it is not a passive receipt of knowledge. It requires shedding the entanglements of the flesh and engaging in strenuous spiritual exercise.
Our source material actually includes a quote from the 19th century Bishop J.C. Ryle that perfectly captures this reality. He wrote, "Holiness costs much. It will cost a man his sins, his self-righteousness, his ease, and his worldliness."
That is a brilliant quote.
It really is. Think about the mechanics of physical training. No athlete becomes strong by sitting in the bleachers admiring the physique of other
It's
athletes.
certainly not by watching lazy athletes.
Right. They have to get on the floor, lift the heavy weights, and break a sweat. They have to push their muscles to the point of failure so the muscle fibers tear and grow back stronger.
The spiritual gymnasium operates on the exact same principle.
Yeah.
You have to break a sweat in your pursuit of godliness.
So this concept provides a devastating critique of modern let go and let God theology, does it not?
It really does. That framework promotes a passive mysticism. It suggests that sanctification happens when we stop trying and just let God take over.
But the source texts argue vehemently against that. They say godliness does not arrive via a sudden charismatic zap or a mystical download during an emotional worship service.
No, it is the result of deliberate, daily, cross-bearing obedience. The false teachers believed godliness came through mystical visions and dietary restrictions.
But Paul asserts it comes from the excruciating discipline of applying the word and mortifying sin. The command to train yourself just shatters the illusion of passive Christianity.
It really does. But that brings up a really crucial question. If sanctification requires such agonizing, sweat-inducing effort, how does one avoid slipping into works-based legalism?
Yeah, that is a huge concern. If I am constantly focused on my own exertion, my own training, my own discipline, it sounds like I am trying to earn my way to heaven.
And this is where the authors bridge into the theological core of the documents. We're talking about the Christological engine here. The texts fiercely oppose any system that relies on human merit.
Let us pause on Pelagianism for a second. For you listening who might not be fresh on 5th century church history, we are basically talking about the idea that humans can pull themselves up by their own moral bootstraps without God's grace.
And the texts reject that entirely. They also reject Arminianism and the Roman Catholic system of merit and penance.
So the discipline commanded in 1 Timothy 4, verse 7 rests entirely upon the finished work of Jesus Christ and his imputed righteousness.
Yes, imputed righteousness is like a massive financial trust fund that you did not earn. It is credited to your account, and you live out of that wealth.
The relationship between justification and sanctification is the absolute key to understanding this balance. Believers do not train to earn their salvation.
Right. They train because they are already justified by grace alone, through faith alone.
And Christ perfectly modeled this exact discipline. In the wilderness, he engaged in spiritual athleticism by rejecting satanic myths with the authoritative phrase, "It is written."
And in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see the absolute pinnacle of this training.
Right, where he sweat drops of blood as he submitted his human will to the divine decree.
So our discipline is entirely dependent on his finished work. The power for our training does not come from a fleshly reservoir. It flows directly from union with the resurrected Christ.
Okay, let us posit a scenario based on that. Suppose I am in the spiritual gymnasium and I fail. I drop the weight. I succumb to a profane myth, or I grow incredibly lazy in my habits.
It happens to all of us.
Yeah. Doesn't this strict command to train yourself just crush me under the weight of my own failure?
According to the logic of the source text, the law of this command does indeed condemn our laziness. It exposes our inability to discipline ourselves apart from Christ.
But it simultaneously drives us back to the cross for mercy, right?
Yes, it reveals our desperate need for Christ as our priest to forgive our failures. And it shows our need for him as our king to rule over our unruly affections.
The law crushes our self-reliance so that grace can empower our obedience.
That dynamic is the heartbeat of Reformed theology regarding progressive sanctification. It is a synergistic work where God works in us, and we work out our salvation with fear and trembling.
The text destroys the prosperity gospel, which promises material comfort by demanding agony.
And it destroys antinomianism, which is the idea that grace means we do not have to obey moral laws by demanding effort.
But it grounds all of that effort in the grace purchased on the cross. We are not running a race to attain an uncertain prize. We are striving with the energy that Christ powerfully works within us.
Exactly. Now, when bridging this to the 21st century, the authors do not hold back at all.
No, they do not. They draw a direct line between the Ephesian myths and modern movements. And just to be clear for the listener, we are strictly reporting the specific movements the source material categorizes as modern profane myths.
Right, we are just stating the claims of the text here.
So the sources explicitly target liberal theology. They categorize it as a profane myth specifically for denying biblical inerrancy, the bodily resurrection, and substitutionary atonement.
The text claims that liberalism replaces divine revelation with human opinion. According to the authors, it effectively strips the supernatural reality out of the faith.
Looking further at the text, the authors address sociological frameworks as well. They categorize Marxist-derived critical race theory not as a sociological tool, but as a secular fable.
The logic provided in the source is that it divides the church based on ethnic lines. The text argues that it denies the sufficiency of the gospel to reconcile people to God and to one another.
Furthermore, the source targets the evolutionary theory of origins. The text categorizes macroevolution as a godless myth.
The authors argue that it undermines the historical reality of Genesis. They say it degrades the dignity of humanity created in the image of God.
By rejecting the creator, the culture embraces a fable of random chance, according to the texts. The source also turns its focus inward on church methodology.
Yes, it strongly condemns the seeker-sensitive movement and pragmatism.
The mechanism behind this critique is that pragmatism measures truth by visible success. It attempts to make church comfortable and entertaining rather than reverent.
Basically, it replaces the agonizing gymnasium with a comfortable theater.
The text strongly repudiates the prosperity gospel as well, calling it a heresy that twists God's promises into a mechanism for material wealth. The authors argue it entirely bypasses the call to suffer and train.
Additionally, the source text labels ecumenical compromise with Rome, Mormonism, or Jehovah's Witnesses as holding hands with falsehood.
It categorizes them as systems peddling the very fables Paul condemns because they alter the fundamental nature of justification.
The source material also outlines a definitive cessationist stance.
Could you unpack that a bit based on the reading?
Sure. The texts argue that miraculous gifts, such as tongues and new prophecies, ceased with the apostolic age. Therefore, the source asserts that the charismatic pursuit of modern prophecies and mystical visions is the pursuit of a profane myth.
According to the authors, true discernment does not come from a mystical encounter or a fresh, subjective revelation.
No, it comes from the grueling, constant practice of studying the objective written Word of God. The objective truth trumps the subjective feeling every single time, in their view.
Let us ask you to evaluate the premise the authors lay out here. Think about your own life in light of this command.
It is a heavy thing to consider.
It really is. Are we spending hours every single day consuming the silly myths of social media, secular entertainment, and outrage culture, while our souls are essentially starving to death?
The text demands unyielding habits to counteract this. It calls for systematic Bible reading, agonizing prayer, and faithful Lord's Day worship.
It demands that we actively mortify the sins of the flesh. You cannot be a passive consumer.
If your mind is bloated with the junk food of cultural myths, you will never have the stamina for the spiritual gymnasium.
Summarizing the absolute dichotomy presented in these sources, it comes down to a mutually exclusive choice. You cannot simultaneously entertain worldly fables and train for biblical godliness.
The Christian life is portrayed throughout this material as a theater of war, not a playground.
The broad road is paved with the profane myths of the culture, leading to apostasy, while the narrow road requires sweat-stained discipline.
But the final call to action from the text ensures the believer knows they are not alone in this fight. While the gymnasium is painful, the believer trains by the energy of the indwelling Spirit.
Yes, fully clothed in the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ. As we wrap up this rigorous session of Reformed thinking, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
It is a very practical thought, too.
It is. If someone gained access to your daily calendar and your digital consumption over the last week, if they looked at every minute you spent and every piece of media you consumed, what specific athletic event would they assume you were training for?
That is a sobering question.
Are your habits actively preparing you for eternity, or are you just getting really, really fit for a world that is passing away? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.